Hi everyone, my name is Kira, I'm an English teacher, and in this video we are going to be doing a breakdown of a sample answer based on the cultural context mode from English paper 2, and this one is from 2018. So let's jump in and have a look. So our sample answer here is on the left, and we can see that the two texts that the student has decided to deal with are The Great Gatsby and A Doll's House. So we're going to look at the question, break it down. As always, we have to look at the different layers to the comparative question. They're always quite meaty, and there's always quite a few different aspects to the question, and it's really important that we get to grips with all of those. Then we'll have a quick look at the marking scheme, and then we're going to break down the main body of the essay, the main arguments, and look at the subtopics. So the question then, aspects of cultural context affect the extent to which a character can be happy or successful within the world of a text. So questions often start with a little quote like this, and then there's quite a lengthy description, as well as a lengthy question which follows. And it's really important to read each part of this carefully. Like, look how long the question is. You need to spend time breaking down the question. So let's kind of pull out what's important out of this particular question. Well, first, the cultural context. So we need to think about what is the cultural context in our particular text that we're dealing with. So the world in which these people live, what kind of behaviors, what kind of cultures and rituals and different social aspects that are happening, in this particular world. So for example, wealth, gender and power are three that we're going to be looking at in this essay. Secondly, then the specifics of the question. So the impact on the character's success or happiness. So we're going to identify a central character, and then we're going to look at how all of these aspects of the cultural context affect their ability to be happy or to be successful. Okay, and then obviously the last part is usually something like support your answer with reference to the text. So that's suggesting the idea of key moments and evidence, and we really need to think about each of the texts in relation to key moments, really. So we're boiling them down to a handful of key or important sort of scenes or chapters or moments, depending on the text itself. Now, one thing that struck me from this particular question, which I think was a real shame, because it is a lovely sample answer and it's very well written, but in the question it does say identify a central character in each of 3 texts. So like we've said before, it's really important in the comparative section to read the question carefully, and at higher level you are required to study 3 texts. You may only be asked for at least 2, but you have to read the question carefully. In this instance, you're being asked to do 3, and in this essay the student has only really looked at 2. So that would obviously be quite a severe penalty on the marks. So let's have a look at the marking scheme then, so we can see what in particular we're looking for. And again, we've got our PCLM, which is hugely important across all aspects of the English paper. And we're just going to highlight a couple of areas of the specifics of the question. So the aspect of cultural context which affects happiness and success, and the extent to which the chosen character are most affected. So really we're talking about the central characters, how they are a product of their cultural context, and how that cultural context affects their ability to succeed or to be happy in their lives. And also so important is the comparative element. So evidence of comparison within the mode. So compare constantly, always drawing connections across the 2 texts and within each of these topics, as mentioned in the cultural context. For example, wealth, power, gender, whatever it might be, that we're constantly drawing connections across. Okay, so into the main body, and as I mentioned, some of those subheadings there. When we're structuring our ideas for cultural context, in this particular instance with these 2 texts, the subtopics are wealth, gender roles and power. Now they would be very common ones, and they play an integral role in any kind of culture and any social setting or social context. But it depends on what your texts are. You can choose other areas as well, like marriage maybe, or the world of work, or something else that war or other conflict or other areas of the social context that might be relevant to your particular text. So when we're putting these are going to be our subtopics. These are going to be our ideas. This is under the heading of cultural context. We're keeping in mind the focus on the central character and their ability to succeed and to be happy. And a couple of things to remember: organize our points. Well, we've kind of done that on the right hand side. We're going to link from one point to the next. We're always keeping in mind the question, and we're going to constantly compare and draw connections. That's really important. So straight into wealth then, the idea of money and people's ability to succeed and to maybe to have nice things like that, and obviously it's probably the biggest theme that we see in Great Gatsby and in A Doll's House. They're huge. It's a hugely important aspect of the kind of cultural context as well. So looking firstly at some of the comparisons that are made. Well, both Nora and Gatsby are deluded, so that's drawing without having to say in this text and in this text. We're just connecting the two characters in each of those texts. So Nora is from A Doll's House and Gatsby is from A Great Gatsby. Both believe that this, both texts suggest this. Some key moments then, again, some nice use of quotation in this paragraph. You don't always have to use lots and lots of quotation. It's not like the single text, but you do have to refer to the key moment itself as kind of a reference or as evidence. And then the relation, we have to bring this back to the question. So how has, the wealth of these characters, or maybe their inability to get wealth, or maybe they're striving for wealth, how has it affected their ability to be successful or how to be happy? So affluence is largely irrelevant in terms of achieving happiness. That's kind of what we've learned from these two particular texts. Now, gender roles, how has this affected the central character and their ability to be successful or to be happy? Well, firstly, let's look at some comparisons. So the men in the texts and how they treat women. So we're going to compare the two, the men in both of these texts. And in both texts, the male characters react with cruelty and disdain. So that's a similarity across both texts there. How the men treat their women, or their wives, I suppose, or their girlfriends, depending on if it's Gatsby. The impact of gender roles on success. So how is the role of your gender, or how, whether you're male or female, how does that affect your ability to be successful in this particular society or in this particular context? Well, being male and educated gives people power. And how could either Myrtle or Nora possibly be happy in a relationship where they are completely undermined? So there's a suggestion that, even it doesn't matter who they are as an individual, but being a woman means they're already restricted and already some levels of success is kind of out of their reach. Thirdly then, power. And power is subdivided into two kind of slightly different points, but the first one is just a general sense of power. Well, firstly, let's look at the comparison. So both Gatsby and A Doll's House have characters that are disenfranchised as a result of the lack of power. So if somebody doesn't have power, they're kind of cast aside almost. Both Krogstad and Myrtle are evidently hugely aspirational, so they're both looking to get some kind of power or control in their lives, to varying degrees of success. So Krogstad and Myrtle as kind of secondary characters are compared here, and it's a nice thing to do as well, not always comparing the main character or the central character, not constantly just talking about maybe Gatsby and Nora or Daisy and Nora or something like that. The secondary characters play a huge role in the story as well, and they tell us a huge amount about power as a factor in a cultural context and how important it is. So ultimately we see that the lack of power equals a lack of happiness or a lack of success, and that's kind of how that some of these characters have there's a negative impact on their happiness, and their inability to kind of gain control or gain power over their own lives suggests that they won't end up being particularly happy. So there's kind of a direct link between the two. So an element of cruelty and anger that negates happiness. So there's a sense that people abuse their power and they use it for negative things, resulting in people lacking that level of happiness for most of our characters in these two particular texts. And continuing on with the sense of power, but this time it's more of disempowerment and the lack of power, I suppose, and specifically the disempowerment of women is a really common thread through both texts. So this is where we see the comparisons. Both texts, both women adopt this. In both texts, the men are on a societal high ground. So lots of connections and similarities across both texts here. And again, another comparison is that there's an inferiority and a powerlessness. So, for example, in A Doll's House, Nora conforms to Torvald's view of women, and there's a powerlessness there, that she's become she's disempowered, I suppose, by her husband. Women evidently subordinate both their voice and their individuality, and with this their happiness. So there's a direct link between a lack of power and a lack of happiness, and that's really what happens to I suppose both of the female protagonists in both of these texts, that when their power is taken away from them, their ability to be happy has also been taken away from them. So that brings to the end of those three subtopics. And as I said, you could choose other subtopics if you prefer, but these three are very common ones for any cultural context question. But certainly for these particular texts, I would say these three are the most important. Ultimately, a really strong sample, a really strong essay overall, but unfortunate that only 2 texts were dealt with when the question has required that 3 should be dealt with. So coming back to our sample there, and For the full sample version, for the full essay and an annotated version, you can go to Studyclix.